the thoughts, we have an incredible privilege among us. We're privileged to have among us today a true visionary in public policy and finance. With decades of experience shaping India's financial landscape, from capital markets to economic governance, he brings a perspective that is both rare and completely invaluable. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor and a privilege to invite him on stage. Please welcome the former Secretary, Ministry of Skill Development and Entrepreneurship, Government of India, Dr. K.P. Krishnan. Round of applause. Sir, thank you so much for being here. Super excited to have you here and hear you speak. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Morning, all of you. It's great to be here today with this fabulous audience. Some of you may know I've sort of spent a lifetime in the government doing policy regulation, and perhaps half of that period doing academic research, teaching, again on finance and regulation. But I must confess, this is the first ever time in my life I have come into a serious financial sector conference where perhaps one needs to do a Shah Rukh Khan act in a semi-disco setting. So it's not something I'm entirely familiar with, but nevertheless, certainly looks like a fun session, and I hope what I say will be of use and fun to a lot of you. Cyrus early on spoke about the traffic woes of the city. I belong to the city. I currently live in Delhi, but I belong to the city, and the state is my cadre. Those of you who are familiar with the IAS would know this notion of a state cadre. So when I came to the state, when was it? A little after Alexander invaded India, in 1984 or something, this used to be what was called a non-fan station. Those of you who have familiarity with government and army and armed forces would know our entitlements, when you moved, the house that you got, the allowances that you got, depended on the classification of the city, and Bangalore was a non-fan station, which meant you didn't even get money to buy fans because the city did not need fans. It was also a retiree's paradise. So we were told. People who had sort of gotten into Vanaprastha came to Bangalore, and from then, clearly, to become a city with more unicorns than most countries can boast of is some journey. And this journey clearly, is equally about the city, about the state, but I think more than people realize about India, about public policy, about regulation. This is not a pitch for policy and regulation. Many of you perhaps are victims of policy and regulation, but this is just to give you an understanding of the context of policy, regulation, the objectives of policy and regulation, and how is it going to play out for the spaces that you guys occupy. So essentially, this is about the sort of story of how did India move, and how did India move from an economy which was more resembling the sort of erstwhile Soviet Union to what it is today, and why is there tremendous resilience in the story. And in keeping with what Harshal said, in keeping with the Netflix type sort of context of today, this story is in 2 seasons. Season 1 is about the journey till now. And a quick preview of season 2 is what is it that the future holds for us in terms of policy and regulation. Let's start with episode 1 of season 1. Recently independent India, I'm talking about the late 40s, early 50s, very suspicious of foreign capital. We were enslaved because of foreign capital, and we were enslaved because of foreign capital mixing up with foreign government and reducing us to the stage of penury over a 200-300 year sort of time frame. Clearly, this was a situation which was suspicious of markets, suspicious of anything called trade, commerce, because those were precisely the instruments that enslaved us. In that context, and also remember, in the early 50s, this was also the consensus of the times. Almost the entire world was moving to a situation where the state, the government, led the economic story. The government controlled, as it did in India, the commanding heights of the economy, to use the jargon of those times. In other words, create public sectors, set up large industries, all funded by government, very few consumer-facing activities, and the state effectively controlling flow of all kinds of resources, whether it's capital, whether it's land, and directing entrepreneurship and labor to activities that the state or the government thought were necessary. And this is the India that we see almost non-stop, plus minus, policy changes here and there, from 50 to 90, and in keeping with our OTT sort of analogy, this is the India of what I call Do Bigha Zameen. If you remember that famous movie, a rickshaw puller from perhaps somewhere in eastern India, Bihar or eastern UP, going to Calcutta, and at the end of the film, having lost land, almost losing his livelihood, there is a bit of hope in the horizon, but it's not a very happy story. It's a story of the state running the economy and individuals essentially being denied serious agency. And what did sort of this India achieve in terms of outcomes? Before we moved to the sort of India of the Chakde times, what did this India achieve? This India, as you can guess, achieved not too much. Very little gross capital formation, and a lot of the gross capital formation that you see, which are still in single-digit trillion rupees, a bulk of it is government capital formation. It's not private sector capital formation, so not much to show in terms of serious investment, notwithstanding the fact that the government was spending money on all of those huge public sectors. We're still talking about small volumes. We are also talking about GDP growth, which are still in very, very small numbers. We are talking about 10 to 25 in a sort of something like a 30-40 time frame, where just about doubling of GDP at a time when population is hugely increasing. And we are talking about a decline in share of poverty. This was to happen. The entire effort was focused on poverty alleviation, but what will be interesting is to see the rate of poverty alleviation, which we will do later. But from here, we move on to something far more exciting, which is the famous 1990-91 reforms led by the then PM Narasimha Rao, led by the then FM Dr. Manmohan Singh, and we are all familiar with a lot of the macro stories. India opened up, India made it easier for us to start industries, licensing got abolished, India did a lot of financial sector reforms, India created, for instance, the Securities Exchange Board of India. So there was a lot of economic reforms that India did, and I'm sure all of us as observers, as students, are familiar with all this. What I want to draw your attention, is to the fact that this was also the time that Fintech revolution actually begins in India. This is not a story that many people know, so maybe with your permission, I'll spend a couple of minutes on this. We are all familiar with the famous Harshad Mehta scam of 1992, made popular by that Sony serial, which I'm sure a lot of us have seen. This scam was actually about money being taken out from the fixed income market by forging a whole bunch of instruments. Essentially, this was a fiddle in the fixed income market or the debt market. But what did the creative, imaginative politicians of India do? And this is a terrific, positive story that needs to be told and retold. They realized that the 1990s India was about companies like Infosys, Wipro, and a whole bunch of similar companies. And what distinguishes these from our old generation companies is something that you guys know very well: asset light, human talent intensive, IPs, and future flow of income rather than heavy current asset base. What does this kind of an industry, what does this kind of a market need? It needs risk capital. It doesn't need so much debt capital. Using the Harshad Mehta scam, which is actually a scam in debt markets, Manmohan Singh and Narasimha Rao stand up in parliament and say, we need to solve this problem. What do we need to do? And in a tremendous act, in a sense of subterfuge, they actually create a vibrant equity market ecosystem for India. They create SEBI. But that's not the fintech story. The story they create is what follows. Perhaps the most successful startup of India, in my opinion, the National Stock Exchange. Some of you may know this. First ever for-profit corporate entity doing stock exchange business is India, not New York. Sweden had attempted, but the first one was National Stock Exchange. But what did National Stock Exchange do which made it very different from the Bombay Stock Exchange? It was use of telecom and IT. Given that India was at the starting point of an IT telecom revolution, what did they do? Parallelly, we created something called the Depositories Act of 1996, which is what we now take completely for granted, namely dematerialization of equity shares. Think back, what is this piece of legislation? It is effectively like the sub-registrar office with which all of you are familiar, going, buying land, registering it in a government department, effectively was taken out of government, handed over to a company which has been given the right to handle property rights and using technology. So the base of everything that you call fintech actually is somewhere here. And that is around the time that Rangarajan, as governor of RBI, pushes all the banks into greater degree of computerization. Bimal Jalan shows up a little later and creates a whole bunch of new private sector banks, all of which take us into the era of finance with technology and telecom. And those of you who probably recall this time would remember a bulk of these times we had governments like the Deve Gowda government, not exactly known to be quote unquote most progressive, most liberal, or in tune with modern technology. Deve Gowda personally pushed a constitutional amendment that was required to bring about the depositories legislation. The reason for telling you this is public policy may be slow, but public policy understands, I think, the pulse of the people far better than we are willing to acknowledge, and launches this terrific sort of growth of gross capital formation, GDP, poverty, and so on. stories that you're familiar with. Given that we have a sort of few minutes left, let me quickly move on to episodes 4, 5, 6 and give you a quick preview of season 2. Episodes 4, 5, 6 are the sort of equivalent of taking to the masses what had been done in the mid-90s. If the equity story is about 1% of India, the percent that actually owns equity shares, small number of companies that issue shares, Aadhaar is about making this story much more a mass story. And I think this is the lesson that we all need to keep in mind. Politics in a democratic environment has the responsibility to a much larger audience than this audience. So this task is constantly about how do you make for people what is good for the elites. And Aadhaar is a classic example of technology being put in place for essentially solving what are large mass problems. And Harshil and others spoke about UPI and a whole bunch of other subsequent technological developments which have now taken this entire Aadhaar and earlier foundations to a level where it's now almost sort of pan-India scale. Are we, given where we are today, well placed to take this forward? Is India well positioned to be the startup leader? Clearly, my personal and I think the general consensus answer is yes. Why? Some people have doubts about whether we can continue to be globally connected, which was the sort of the foundation of a lot of what we did in the 90s. The fact that we allowed foreign capital to come in. Indian equity analysts in the 1990s did not know how to value a firm like Infosys. FPIs knew this, and we opened our world to the FPIs. Is today a world that is hospitable to being globally connected? I think the answer is yes. Just look at the numbers. India is 1.5% of global FDI. India is less than 2% of global trade, less than 4 or 4.5% of global trade in services. Less than 1.5% of international tourist arrivals come to India. Less than 5% of the global entertainment market, this huge market that we are proud of, we are less than 5% of the global market. So even with a world which may not be as globally connected as it was in the past, I think the barriers on us to grow are far, far away. So I think we are well positioned in a global sense to become the startup leader. What does policy, what does regulation have to do? Policy and regulation have to reiterate the foundations which led us to this point, namely, continue to argue for an international rules-based global order where we can continue to grow globally, equally focus internally on what the current economic survey calls get out of the way. Governments contribute more in entrepreneurship by keeping away, but remember, there is a role that governments need to play in keeping this balance. And what is that role? Early on, Hillen spoke about a new product called buyer protection. What would a regulator's response to this be? He would quickly look at it and examine, is this an insurance product? Because if it's an insurance product, it needs to be backed by capital. That is the role of regulation. Hillen and teams have to create disruptive products, but a Reserve Bank of India, whose job is to protect us by ensuring stability, which is the antithesis of disruption, needs to do this balance. So public policy and regulations will take time to catch up, but they will catch up and enable. On this happy note, let me wish all of you entrepreneurs here and Razorpay all the very best and ensure that we do end up as the startup leader of the globe. Thanks so much.